Fantastic. Good afternoon, everybody who's here with us and all our guests online. We're delighted to welcome you to this session. It's really a power-packed, inspiring session entitled African Life-Centered Design, Designing Futures with Indigenous Wisdom, Life-Centered Designs. I am honored to moderate a session with very familiar faces, friends, and colleagues in the creative industry, exploring the construction of next frontier approach to strategy, development, and design through an ethos that goes beyond being human-centered and instead anchors all life, its interconnectedness and artistic expression. We'll talk through the framework, its origin and aspirations, and then look at some practical applications. But before I do that, I'd love to introduce our esteemed panelists and panel of power women from Africa and the diaspora, our inherited sister, Monika. I'd like to introduce Amukelani Muyanga, is a founding principle of MM&Co. Fundamentally, Amukelani is an Africanist feminist dedicated to collaboratively building a tech-enabled, pro-poor, and climate-smart future across public, private, and civil society sectors. In all her roles, she gets called on to think through problems and then coordinate stakeholder and technology to solve them, either as a product designer, consultant, product manager, and product manager. She is a fierce proponent of justice, good governance, non-commodified wellness, decolonized education, both good and bad, art. Amu is also the founder and director of the Well and Mental Health Holistic Wellness Ecosystem that is the first port of entry for mental health, wellness, and well-being, with a majority women of color as its client base. Amu is South African, fluent in Sesotho, isiZulu, Xhosa, Setswana, and has lived and worked in Singapore, Cambodia, Sri Lanka, the United States of America, Kenya, Ethiopia, Rwanda, another Pan-Africanist, I love this, Nigeria, and the United Kingdom. She is based here in the City of Gold. Wow. 3 cheers for Amu. I'd now like to welcome Pumla Maswanganyi, who is also founding principal of MM&Co. Her journey is deeply rooted in democratizing access to art and design and using them as tools to promote the achievement of development mandates. Educated as a studio artist and development practitioner, her approach is multidisciplinary. She has also been informed by her global experience through her work and education across 5 continents. She's also the founder and director of By Lu, an art and design practice creating experiences and products centered on pushing culture forward and celebrating heritage. Through her work, Pumla has partnered with organizations including the African Union, Soho House, MTN, Qatar Foundation, Roddenberry Foundation, Roche, and Tomorrow's Air, among others. She has worked with the above organizations in various capacities, including a speaker, advisor, strategist, and creator, all with a focus on implementing policies and improving lived experiences. Her ultimate goal is to make life-changing, beautiful things for those who often go unseen. Welcome, Pumla. I'd now like to welcome and introduce Monika Bielskyte. Did I get that right?
Almost.
Yeah. Almost. Bielskyte. She's a futurist who challenges the determinism of both dystopian and utopian narratives. Instead, she suggests a pathway towards future visions that are truly inclusive and livable. Her futurism is defined by informed hope, yet firmly anchored in contextual, complex, human and environmental realities on the ground, rather than a one-size-fits-all techno-solutionism prone to short-term hype cycles and rapid obsolescence. Monika has done speaking and advisory work for a majority of companies, the media industry, cities, governments, and NGOs. Monika was born in the Soviet Union and grew up in newly liberated Lithuania, witnessing and participating in the simultaneous collapse of the physical walls and opening up the digital world. Her current home here in Johannesburg, South Africa. Her current home is here in Johannesburg, South Africa. In between, she went on a decade-long nomadic journey through 100 countries, living with and within learning from local leaders and citizens across various backgrounds. Prototypes have been created by Monika socially and environmentally in terms of engaging the future, which you'll hear a little bit about as we speak. Monika has created, her Hollywood experience includes future consultancy for Disney and Marvel's Black Panther, Wakanda Forever, with expertise in information technology and immersive media, generative AI, spatial computation, virtual reality, user interface, and user experience. Monika looks beyond the superficial trends to examine both the promises and perils of innovation as the blurring boundaries between the digital and physical worlds become increasingly weaponized. Monika's worked again for Microsoft, Google, Disney, BBC, Universal, Tata, and Hawaii. So, as you can tell, we have a really esteemed panel here who have traversed the globe and are really so well equipped to take us on this important conversation. And I'd like now to hand over to Amu.
And I'd like to hand over to Pumla.
Morning, morning, morning. I'd like to invite us all to take a quick deep breath, just so we center ourselves in this moment. Amazing. Welcome to African Life-Centric Design. And we will go right in by starting off with talking about Shudu. So this is Shudu, a globally recognized supermodel, if you will, of South African descent, who has had the opportunity of gracing various platforms from Elle to Women's Wear Daily, Vogue Australia, and been featured in campaigns of Belman, Furla, and other really big global brands. And this is obviously an incredible feat all around, much less for an African woman. And one would believe this is a win for Africa, for South Africa, until we unpack the fact that Shudu is not only not real and is a virtual creation, but has been created by a designer, if you will, Cameron Wilson, who is from the United Kingdom. And there are many interesting things here to think through around the ethics of a figure like Shudu that is built by a Western person, if you will, in the likeness of an African, who is also said to be modeled after the Princess of South Africa, according to Cameron Wilson. Yet, while South Africa obviously is very diverse and has multiple ethnicities and complexions, I think we can all agree that she is probably more reminiscent of Lupita Nyong'o of Kenya, if anything. And so you have to wonder, is this actually a win? And for who is it a win? When Black models struggle to get work and be featured on these campaigns, whereas this virtual influencer model, if you will, that is a construct, gets all these work opportunities that we struggle to see. And so this is a moment for us to really think through, for whose benefit do we create? And from what foundation do we create? And also question this idea of inclusion for inclusion's sake. And so there's an opportunity for us to reflect on the fact that predatory inclusion is in fact a perpetuation of violent colonial extraction. And so with this moment, it is really important for us to think through who has defined design over the decades, what have been the prominent narratives, and how is African life-centric design presenting a different approach that we can model our creation around, if you will. And with that, I'll hand it over to Monika to go through these different phases for us.
Thank you, Pumla. The evolution of design, from extractivism to regeneration, hopefully. So, the paradigm upon which so much of technology has been built is user-centered design. Sounds nice, right? But what is it really about? If we only think of humans as users, as consumers, how does that reduce us in our very humanity? And this was positioned as an actually positive framework, but has been profoundly detrimental. If we only see humans for what they use and how to maximize their using of products and technologies, what kind of harms that ends up creating. So, that was the paradigm dominated in the 1980s, yet still persisting to today. So in order to make it better, it was transformed into human-centered design. But human, really as an individual human, removed from a broader social context. Yet, does any of us exist like that? I remember there was one time only when I went to Burning Man, because people were telling me that was just naysayer for naysayer's sake. So I was like, okay, if I need to criticize something, I need to see it with my own eyes. And then that year, at the back of Burning Man catalog, there was this writing, only you are responsible for your own desires. That is absolutely a lie. Everything that we are, everything that we think, everything that we do has been constructed by the generations that come before us. So we have to acknowledge that interconnectedness and how, as humans, we do not exist apart from each other. And then we see this huge gap when nothing really much was changing in that perception. And so, more recently, Don Norman, a really illustrious UX thinker, has proposed a new paradigm, humanity-centered design. Well, I have a little anecdote behind that. Don Norman, in fact, has invited myself and a few other brilliant colleagues, Pumla among them, Angela Baines and Kevin Bethany, to participate in his project around future of design education. I had to explain the most basic things around racism, ableism, perpetuation of colonialism through design. And I had to repeat it over and over again. Were we rewarded for our participation? We were promised visibility. Instead of that, a Fast Company article came out where all of our ideas were watered down, of course, with no credit. And he became a proponent of humanity-centered design. But is that even enough? If we think only as humanity about our interactions with each other, with other individuals of the human species, are we really seeing the full picture? I argue that we do not. Because the truth is that we are interconnected with all life. We have co-evolved over millions and hundreds of thousands of years with all life. Within our very bodies, 30 trillion cells are ours, versus about 40 trillion cells that are our microbiome. None of us is an individual as a human within society, but also none of us is an individual as removed from the living world that we are fully interdependent with. Behind this image is an illustration from the West world. And what we see is how sci-fi perpetuates our understanding of what is possible for our future. This notion that even if they're not humans, but human-like creatures, could be printed out from inanimate material and exist in a fiction of their own, or as so much of the futurist discourse, and of course sci-fi proposes to us that we could just go and colonize Alpha Centauri or even Mars, as removed from all of the life here on Earth. This is an idea stuck in mid-20th century understanding of scientific reality. This is not where the bleeding edge of scientific research is. So it is of utmost importance to really move past not just user-centered design, not just human-centered design, but also humanity-centered design towards life-centered design that understands and acknowledges all of these interconnections. And this is not to say that humans are the virus or we need to become post-human. This is to acknowledge that the roots of our indigenous ancestors saw how humans can participate in the cycle of life and be the custodians of it. How, if we actually understand that interconnectedness, we can be a truly meaningful, truly contributing part of that system. So decentering humans actually ensures humanity's thriving today and in the long term.
Granted, when we say African life-centric design, we recognize that Africa is not a monolith. Otherwise, we would be perpetuating the same colonial ideas that shape our 54 different countries and multiple other territories as though we have a singular way of doing things. That said, what we recognize is that the future of our continent requires a shared Pan-African vision. And this is what we propose with our African life-centric design approach and principles. We need a unified vision that celebrates our plurality while inviting unity. Again, to reiterate, this is not about a sameness. This is not about doing the same things or that we have the same ideals and the same ways of achieving this goal. But it does mean that we have a unified North Star, and we can choose any which path that feels the most resonant with our backgrounds, with our environment, with our experience to achieve that goal. And it is with that that we begin to really go into what African life-centric design is and the various principles within it. So ALCD, for short, establishes a platform for us as Africans and Africans within the diaspora to prototype and to shape our own futures in a way that is locally informed and globally impactful. This is something that Nnedi Okorafor has spoken to, that when we have African-defined futurisms, they don't have to apply to everybody else in the world, but often they do, because the approaches and the place that we create from, essentially, really mirrors a lot of the global shared values. But it is important for us to outline what those values are for us and to also provide ourselves the platform to be able to create from a place that we feel, as mentioned, is as resonant as possible. And so with that, we will break down each of our principles. Amu? It is you. Could we also get a second mic, please, from somebody?
Hi, everybody. I really miss having my non-allergy voice. It will return one day. All right, so it was important for us to start with design as ritual, because divine design is valued as sacred, mindful, and connected to larger systems and narrative of a human need for creative expression and spiritual belonging. And like all rituals, prayer, cleaning your home, you don't do it once, right? You return to it, you iterate. It's only valuable in ritual. You're good? Okay. Recognizing origins, we want to immerse ourselves in local design histories, integrating indigenous knowledge and ancestral wisdom into the futuring and foresight process. Something we talk about a lot is what kind of ancestors do we want to be, because we are leaving a legacy with each other in the earth. centering the periphery, and I think it's very interesting how you started, because it's inclusion, but that benefits who? And what we want to counter with this principle is bringing in perspectives of previously marginalized and excluded African narratives ethically, inclusively, and giving credit where credit is due, whether it's for your likeness, your ideas, your thoughts, because you are part of this life-centricness that we prioritize.
Yeah, and within that, I think, so we've brought a few advisors, thinkers on board, and one of the things that we heard was, what do we mean by periphery? Is Africa the periphery? And we have had to, kind of go through, essentially break down what we mean by that, which is that Africa is not the periphery, but we're speaking to voices that have been the periphery within Africa's narrative as shaped, again, by people outside of the continent, or sometimes excluded within the continent. Amukelani and I were of Tsonga heritage, for example, and this is a heritage that people, or an ethnic set of groups even, that people don't even know that much about, and certainly don't know much of our histories, or the fact that there are many groups of Tsongas, and we, even us being both Tsonga, we're not from the same, actually, Tsonga clan. And that's really what we're talking about when we say centering the periphery. We mean intentionally looking for those narratives, looking for stories, looking for histories that have, in fact, been a key part of shaping the continent, but haven't been spoken of before.
Yeah. Also in non-traditional ways, like neurodiversity, people with disabilities, those are periphery identities. Right, land is a co-designer. We honor the living world and anchor all design within it, not merely on top of it. We embrace the symbiotic relationship with the ecosystem, considering it as an active participant in the design process. I think a phenomenal example of that is Victoria Yards, right? Like, it's such a good use of space. There's so much life in it, in terms of outside, in terms of businesses, in terms of all of us in here. And you can't just sort of like flatten an area and build this from scratch, right? You have to build Victoria Yards around what is here first. And I think it's excellent that it's almost like we chose the location, Okay. Communal interdependence, we recognize how every individual impacts and contributes uniquely to the community, rooting the design process in tangible communal needs and broader human aspirations. This speaks to what Pumla was saying about plurality, but not necessarily sameness. Great. Regenerative co-creation. We design solutions that emulate and honor nature's circular processes, fostering restoration, nourishment, renewal. We incorporate intergenerational exchange, drawing wisdom from generations past, building for generations to come. Wow, that was so poetic. Adaptive resilience, designed for flexibility and adaptability in the face of change. Instead of committing to a static approach, focus on continuous iteration, learning in light of emerging realities. One of my favorite things to say when I feel like people are falling into a sunk cost fallacy, I'm like, just because a mistake took you a lot of time to make, doesn't mean you should stick with it, Yeah.
And with this being our final of our current set of principles, I think we really do want to end on this idea of this adaptiveness, because I think often when we think of culture, or when we even think of Africanness, or even designing these African futures, there is a bit of a trap to kind of look back or go back to how it used to be before we were colonized, or how would it be if we went back 500 years ago and used that perspective to design our futures. And that act is futile, because not only can we not do that, but we are here now, and we can use this as a more empowered base for us to envision where we're headed, because this is the experience that we know. Yeah. We don't know what we don't know. What we should do is to uncover as much as we can of that history, because it obviously can reveal to us why we do what we do today. But it's important to sort of hold the two ideas in balance, this sort of looking at history as a recognition or as a foundation to further bolster you today to act and envision what you want to. And also the secondary point to this is that culture changes, as it should, because everything evolves. The environment evolves as well. And so culture is not static. And that's also, again, the trap of looking back and thinking that without external forces, things would be the same. That's not true. Nature evolves. Things would have changed. And so let us recognize that change and recognize that what we do today is a part of that. And with that, Monika?
Absolutely. And at the end of these principles, we just want to posit that we know that this sounds like very ambitious, but you have to act like it's possible to change the world every day, okay? So keep an open mind about how aspirational these are, because we wouldn't be standing here, you know, putting our reputations on the line if we were, if we didn't believe that this is possible, and we weren't going to spend our time positing it to a group of people who we hope can, you know, come together around this vision with us. Thanks.
Colonial is not just history, and colonial legacy does not just persist in the physical realm of the present. It's not just about the land resources getting taken over. It's also addressing how this colonial heritage and colonial legacy can limit and warp our imagination of the future. And so we need to re-examine that and to really think, how do we move past that? Because radically hopeful future imagination is not some luxury item. It is indeed a strategy for survival and a pathway to flourishing. Even when things within the physical realm seem despairing, hopeless, and impossible, we always start with a dream and imagination. Unless we have that, unless we see it, we cannot do it. So all action begins with a vision.
As we head into our conversation moment now, we urge you to consider this less a presentation and more an invitation. And let us use this as a moment to reflect on whether we want to live as an exotica in someone else's future imagination, and if not, we need to dare to create our own. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much to this incredible trifecta of pioneers, if you like. Emerging is all about being open to pioneering ideas and pioneering perspectives. I think that it would be really wonderful to actually start from the beginning, and I guess for guests who have joined us physically just now, perhaps give us a really sort of short overview of how you have all come together, just in terms of your personal, collaboration as a trifecta, what's brought you together. I know that Amu is very much leading the empirical economic side of things. Pumla is looking at the cultural framework in terms of the project, and then Monika is looking at the technical. But kind of what has informed your coming together in a nutshell?
Well, cool. So I think on a super personal level, we met sitting front row at a TED Talk all those years ago. We met as, an 8-year-old and a 6-year-old in primary school and have been together ever since. But at a kind of intellectual curiosity, dreaming level, we basically have kind of multiple layers to our identities. Obviously, what you read is maybe more the headliner of if we have to pick one thing that we represent, But as much as Amukelani represents this economic view, she also has this development background, which I also have, in addition to a studio art background, which Monika also has, in addition to the more sort of technological. So has been emerging of those ways of seeing, of recognizing that to envision future possibilities, there is a need for a multidisciplinary approach. And there's a need to marry different ways of seeing, different ways of doing, in order to achieve the shared goals that we have. And I think that's truly what brings us together. And now in terms of how it brings us together as it pertains to these principles, it is the recognition that truly, as we said, we saw a gap in the theories surrounding how we create and how we should create. Having gone to art school and also having studied design a bit, everything that we learned was from a Western framework, of course. You know, from the definition of art and how some African creations would be considered as artisanal goods, all the way to even having the sort of Egyptian art viewed as like a separate higher section compared to sub-Saharan art in most museums. It is really those ideas that we've seen that have made us think about who gets to define what art is, who gets to define what creation is, design is, who gets to create, who gets to define what the best approaches for designing solutions are and for who. And that interrogation really made us realize that we're not included in these narratives, and we have to build something that we can put out there to propose a different way of seeing that resonates with us.
Fantastic, and I think I'd like to, that highlights really an example that we have in the room. In fact, Gilmore took liberty to say, look, I'd like to point the audience to an exhibition, an installation that is entitled, I Wear My Culture. And it really is a wonderful opportunity to actually embody this conversation that we're having here that says, on the one hand, there's this idea of Africa and Afrocentricity and Pan-Africanism, but that who is the kind of, there's a binary, there's always a kind of Africa and the world. And so until we are centering those conversations, as you propose, relevant to us, I wondered if you could just tell us a little bit about, where you see African institutions, their role in this conversation and language, if you like. So we have a number of African institutions in, sort of museums that are mirroring, I suppose, the Western model. How do we start to really integrate African ways of creating relative to, the project that you guys have established?
I think it'd be great to talk about the Museum Futures work that you're involved in. Because that was a great perspective in terms of preservation and the different models for preserving things, right? So there's like heritage sites, as you say, there are museums, there are galleries, there's social media. And it was a challenge to conceptualize what does preservation look like that isn't a mirror of the things that we've seen.
Right.
Sure, I mean, in summation, I think where we start is by thinking about the places of these institutions. As you say, they've been mirrored around Western structures. And the fact that we even say institution, immediately you think of a building, right? But what is the place of a museum within our context? Is it, in fact, a building? What does it look like? And even the act of preservation, when we say preservation, we're basically not allowing things to evolve. And so how do we change the idea of creating a space to celebrate what has been, but also doing so in a way that allows it to evolve? So I think we start, it's always the nerdiest thing about me probably is like, I'm a stickler for definitions. I think we start with definitions. How do we define a museum? How do we define an institution? For whose benefit are we defining it that way? And from there, I think the answers of that begin to guide us in the ways rather to reshape those institutions and those structures to fit So it is obviously a very non-answer answer, if you will. Kind of answering your question with a question of how do we define these things, and then how do we begin to unpack that and redefine it.
Yeah, no, thank you. Monika, I'd like to come to you with respect to this idea that Africa is not a monolith and that we're non-homogeneous. And in seeking those definitions, what are some of your views from a technical perspective? Because you have this duality of the global north and AI and, you know, whole sort of technoscape, and perhaps your initiative challenging us and pushing us to really go further to examine our own centers of design excellence from our own center of gravity. So what is your perspective in this sort of, I hate to create another binary, but I think by inference there are these dualities, technology in African-centered that's not monolithic. How do we navigate these conversations?
Yeah, so I want to acknowledge that plurality exists everywhere, right? And that's why it's important we had to specify when we are centering the periphery that we're not thinking of African continent as periphery. But even when we talk about Europeanness or global north, what's interesting is that that narrative is also profoundly limited. So, as you mentioned, I was born in a country that doesn't exist anymore, Soviet Union, and grew up in newly liberated Lithuania, although my roots span the two opposite corners of Eurasian continent. And what's interesting is that so much of what I do has been profoundly influenced by witnessing the collapse of a totalitarian regime. Just a few years before totalitarian system collapsed here. And what's so interesting, right, is how Soviet Union positioned itself as anti-imperialist force, whilst doing imperialism at home, while structuring all of their society, not just during the times of Soviet Union, but since the times of the Russian Tsars, around racial caste, whilst engaging in the same models of extractivist environmental approach, indigenous erasure, ethnic cleansing, etc., etc. And so that's also why I feel today, when we are being positioned that if capitalism is broken, the only other alternative is communism. Now, my ancestors barely survived under the communist regime and under also fascism of Nazi Germany. So I say, are these really the only two choices? Must we really choose by the ideologies of the dead white men? Or is there something beyond? And absolutely there is beyond. And the beyond is not some kind of neutral, bland, vanilla middle center, but truly beyond. And that's where we speak about interdependence. Not just interdependence between us as humans and all nations on earth, because the problems that we face, they are truly global. And so we'll need to approach them not as citizens of individual nations, but truly as citizens of this planet. But also that interdependence with all life. And so I think when we talk today about technology and we start sort of removing ourselves from technology as if technology has its own agency, its own desires, its own volitions, its own trajectories, and that those trajectories are somehow inevitable, the truth is that none of them are. They're all defined by the cultural values, biases, and priorities of those that design them, those that deploy them, and those that get to use or abuse them. And so we need to start thinking beyond this duality and start understanding how technological tools are simply an extension of our minds and of our biology. And when we do that, we have to start taking agency of what kind of futures that represents. And so something that we've been continuously frustrated with is, for example, how the futures of the continent, as well as global South at large, as well as most other colonized peoples, have been represented through this lens of AI. And so people now start finally accepting that, yes, we should be critical of all the data of the past, right? That stigmatizes race, disability, minority genders, et cetera, But again, what I want to bring attention to, it's not just about the data of the past, it's also how that imagination of the status quo limits our thinking of what future could be possible. How whenever we try to put any reference to any particular African culture or architectural style or any region, all of a sudden, no matter how we speak about that this particular image or this particular storyline should be futuristic, we're never provided with that. And so those things won't change until we actually change them.
Yeah. Well, with the time left, I want to throw out the opportunity for the audience to, present their questions. And I know that before we close, I do want us to touch on the idea of decolonization of the imagination, because I think that's a nice way to tie it off around our imagination. But if we could take some questions, we have about 5 minutes, so we'd have to be quite expedient. I see 2 questions on this side.
Thank you so much for that lovely panel. I come from London, if you can hear from my accent, and I went to art school, design school, and like all my lens of design and art has been from a Western world, and I've been very frustrated with that, so I love this panel. I guess my question is, when we talk about design, who is the designer? Because I think there's also that power dynamic of design, and when we think of a lot of the narratives around human-centered design and stuff was coming from like IDEO and a lot of these companies who were trying to democratize design as this thing of anybody could be a designer. And I guess from a LCD value system, who is the designer? Is that anybody, especially when there is that, maybe that barrier or that power dynamic of somebody says, okay, traditionally designers, you go to design school, you get a job, you work at this place, you design this thing, and what is that democratization of design as a designer as well? Who, in that context of the value system, who is essentially that designer?
Thank you. If we could take 2 questions, just in the interest of time. So who's the designer? We have that question. And we had another question, 2 more on the floor, and then we'll throw back to you. We have to be conscious of time. If you could keep your questions short and concise, thank you.
All right, cool. My name is Menzi. I'm from the cohort. So my question revolves around indigenous knowledge. What do we say indigenous knowledge is from the concept or from the context of Europe and from the context of Africa? That's all I want to know.
Thank you. And the last question. So I've written down the 2 questions to remind you.
Hi.
Thank you, Menzi.
Good morning. A quick one. How do we? Okay, I'm from Ted Koza. I represent township economic-based creatives and also rural creatives. I'm just very concerned at times that our discussions are on the periphery in terms of the constituency that we represent, township. And when you're talking black in South Africa, mainly, majority of the black people live in townships and in rural areas. Please, let's bear that in mind. And how do we decolonize and de-racialize and declass, remove the class away from the space of design and arts? Because talking like this, I hear you, but if I had to bring half of the constituency that I represent, they would have no idea what is happening, what is being said here. How do we begin to change that?
Fantastic. Thank you so much. That is a question on, I'll just summarize. There's 3 questions. One is on who's the designer. The second question is the role and the place of indigenous knowledge systems, which I think speaks to the last question and alludes to. And I was also conscious of that when I referenced language. And the language and the paradigms is that the language we use to unpack these conversations. How do we engage and integrate people and bring them along? Not to be diminishing or undermining of people, I imagine that you're suggesting, but actually to be inclusive of people across community and social strata.
I'll address the first design one. So, today there's so much conversation around privilege. And I think what fundamentally privilege is not a particular gender or skin tone, ability, disability. It's really about being fundamentally removed from the consequences of your actions, to be able to be insulated and to have that privilege to also consider not just how the consequences of your actions will not reach you, but also how you can entertain the idea of inaction, right? So, unfortunately, so much of design, and especially design thinking as methodology, has been profoundly top-down. It's kind of about dropping into communities, doing some kind of research, and being like, I've got the answer for you. And I'm so generous as of to do that. Now, the moment you start designing for and not designing with, it is bound to result not just in failure, but oftentimes in active harm. So always design with, not for. And then the final point is really that what we have to consider, I'm dropping the point.
So the three, just in the interest of time, that idea of designing with and ensuring that we are engaging and interconnected. And then the other question around who is the designer?
I mean, because these are a set of principles, right? It is my response to you, on declassing, decolonizing, right? Because you can pitch these at any level, right? We don't own them. They're not a dogma. They're a way of doing things. The same way, I don't know, like mechanics, that's a terrible analogy. But because they're principles and you can almost a la carte them, right? It's going to be a little bit overwhelming for your organization to do this level of transformation. You're going to shock people. It's going to stress people out. But if you embody the ways of doing things, the ways of honoring origins, right? You don't need to use that language to honor origins. Either you do or you don't, right? Either you live these principles or you don't. And if you are in a space that is doing things differently, it's a starting point to be like, this is where we could go, right? Because sometimes recommending change, people want to so badly, but they are like, where's the map? Where do I even start? What makes sense in what order? So when we do more consulting work, you know, we give structure to what this can look like in principle. And you're going to pitch it at the level that's relevant. I mean, we could probably talk to 5-year-olds.
Pumla, as you come to respond perhaps to the last, one of the last questions, we also have a similar question that alludes to that, is how does language contribute or limit inclusiveness and representation? So I think everybody is kind of touching on similar points: Indigenous knowledge, inclusivity, and who the designer is. And I think really to wrap up, it really is important to highlight, and from my perspective, if I may, that it's also starting from where people are. The young people in the townships have perhaps a smartphone, and saying, if this is technology and Nkhono or a grandparent or a gogo is a weaver, then how does a young person and the gogo co-create? And I think that is where the language and inclusivity can start to be practically applied. But I'd like you to summarize from your perspective.
Sure. I mean, I want to emphasize that obviously right now, you know, to your point, we're using words, you know, these sort of lofty and somewhat, we should acknowledge, exclusionary words, because we're mindful of the audience that we're in. We know that those of us who are here today understand this, but that does not mean that we don't, that we have lost touch with the fact that the South African reality is, as you say, truly not represented by the lived experience of us here. The level of privilege we have here is sort of beyond imaginable for someone in a township right now. And I say that coming from a township myself, from 3-rooming Yakokatle home, you know, mo husnang li toilet kahari, the toilet was outside. We didn't even have a bath inside, it was outside. And it was really through education, through school, that I was able to kind of see another way out. And so just to say that really we do share, even though Monika is not from here, we do share that understanding because of our backgrounds truly, and it is actually our backgrounds of exclusion that lead us to propose this way of seeing. So it's built from that foundation, and we obviously are very mindful of the language that we use to convey this, and we ensure that within the different contexts, we take on the language of the people that we're talking to make it make sense.
Yeah. Thank you so much, ladies. I think that this is part of the opportunities for us to interrogate, engage, and explore new ideas, new frontiers, but also be located in our own experience and our own realities, and in order to create that which we wish to see and experience. I'd like to ask you to give a wonderful panel a round of applause. Please do engage with Monika, Pumla, and Amu as you come across them to further explore these ideas and notions. Indigenous knowledge systems is actually a passion point of mine, and I think that there's a great deal that Indigenous communities, South-South, including South America, offer the global North, and that there aren't, one is not exclusive to the other, and I think that we can, in keeping with your themes, co-create and be interconnected in the process of design. Thank you ever so much for being a wonderful audience, and to those online, thank you for chiming in with your questions. Really, really wonderful to learn and engage with each of you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your questions to the audience.